Hey guys, welcome to another big edition of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. My name is Nick.
I'm Ian.
And this week we're going to talk about something we've talked about on our podcast before. If I was a good host, I guess I'd probably go back and tell you what episode number you can go back and check it out. But
You suck. You're terrible.
actually, I guess I can just drop a link in down below to the episode.
Sure.
But we did a while back, it was sometime last year, we did an episode of the Life and Joel podcast, which if you haven't checked it out yet, go check it out. It's Ian and I's podcast we've been doing for a couple of years now. But we did an episode where we I don't think we meant to talk about it, but we got on the subject of people that aren't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that
Probably
really
should be.
They really should be.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to talk about this week. So kind of the I guess where I started this idea was when I realized that Ozzy wasn't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm like,
For his solo work. He's
for
in
a solo,
Sabbath.
he is in there with Sabbath, but it was really, I guess Ozzy's kind of like he's one of the godfathers of heavy metal.
Right.
And how can you have a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and not have Ozzy in it?
Agreed.
Agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
100% agreed.
So one of the things that a lot of people think, at least speculate on the reason that Ozzy hasn't gotten in, is he really pushed in 1999 to have Black Sabbath removed from the nomination process. So a lot of people think that kind of it angered, I guess, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and that's kind of one of the reasons why he hasn't made it in. Because I think it's a really glaring.
I didn't know he did that.
Yeah, he did.
So.
In 1999, yeah, he said that, I don't remember his exact words, but he basically said that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was irrelevant or something along those lines. And yeah, he really kind of pushed to have Black Sabbath removed from the process.
Was it him or was it Sharon?
That I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Because I don't know. Ozzy doesn't seem like he cares about anything. He does what he wants to do and does his thing, but
Yeah.
seems like big decision stuff like
Comes,
that
comes from Sharon.
comes from Sharon.
I can definitely see that. What was someone that you had?
Pat Benatar was one that I noticed. She was nominated for 2020, but she didn't make it.
Well,
in.
she didn't make it. How did they ever? Do they release how close people come? Or?
No, I know she was on the nominated list for 2020, but she's still not in there. Whitney Houston just got in this year.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you call her rock, but you know.
I think that a lot of those artists in the 80s, early 90s, I think they all kind of influenced each other and blended.
I guess
the genres really kind of blend together at
to
that
a point, but I almost think that they should just have, it shouldn't be the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should be the American Music Hall of Fame or the or just world music. I don't know how to describe it, but the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame kind of denotes a certain genre, and it applies that there's others that just.
I don't know. I don't have an issue with it because I know like a lot of people have an issue with. I do have an issue with like jazz musicians not being in.
Right.
Because
there's quite a few of them that are not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where like jazz really heavily influenced rock and roll, blues really heavily influenced rock and roll, R&B, Motown, a lot of that stuff even influenced through the 70s and the 80s with a lot of the rock and roll stuff. So I understand why those kind of artists in there, even like a lot of rap acts. I have no issue with really any of those being in there, just as long as the big rock and roll artists, like you said, Pat Benatar, Ozzy, those kind of artists definitely should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, it's weird to me to see some of the artists that are in there that I just don't see as rock artists, even if.
I think
even above and beyond that, because you can say jazz artists they're not rock, but there's a very distinctive line from jazz and blues to rock and roll. Whereas some of these other artists, it's like, the line is not very distinct.
Yeah, well, and I think some of that's done on purpose to kind of broaden the spectrum of.
Well, doesn't that cheapen the whole point of it, though?
I don't think so, because I don't think so. Just like I said, just as long as you have.
That'd be like putting somebody in the Baseball Hall of Fame just because no one from that team's ever been in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Not because they earned it, but because just no one's from that or because they were the best player on that shitty team.
But I think that it all, like I said, genres really kind of blend together. A lot of them do. How can you have, you can't say that a rap artist from the 90s doesn't influence rock in the 2000s when you look at a band like Linkin Park.
Well, and I'm not even talking about the rock artists. I'm talking about more like the really super duper pop stuff that's in there.
But how can you say that when you've got like pop bands like the Beatles that influence pop music in the
because they
70s, 80s? That's what I'm saying, though, is it all kind of blends together. Yeah. So I have no problem with other artists being in there, just as long as they have like the main rock artists. Right.
Which they don't. There's so many that they don't, that they've been overlooked, not even been nominated.
Yeah.
Ozzy, Pat Benatar, Iron Maiden.
Iron Maiden's a perfect
huge. One. They've sold 100 million records. Probably not that many, but they've sold millions and millions of records.
Absolutely.
And they meet the time criteria. They meet the influence criteria.
Absolutely.
There would be no Metallica if it weren't for Iron Maiden. Mm-hmm. And Metallica's in there.
Yeah.
So, and how many bands have been influenced by Metallica? So it's a long stretch that goes all the way back. They're not in there. Motorhead is not in there. I mean, they're not huge, but they're huge enough. Mm-hmm. Lemmy's influence on many artists is significant.
Absolutely.
And you can even take him. He goes back to the 70s with Hawkwind.
Yeah.
So.
I also look at a band like Motley Crue, who is probably one of the biggest, most influential bands of the 80s.
I don't know about influential, but they're big.
I think there's probably a lot of music. There's definitely a lot of music that took place in the 90s that maybe doesn't necessarily go back to the sound of Motley Crue, but the attitude, the show of Motley Crue. I don't think you can say they weren't an influential band.
Yeah, I don't know. I just kind of see Motley Crue as kind of like the tail end of that whole the Kiss thing, where it's
the show,
and it's all about the money and the fame and everything.
And Nikki Sixx has even said that a lot of the antics that they had in the 80s, the way they carried themselves, a lot of the things that they did really kind of hurt them in the nomination process.
Right.
But he's another artist I don't think really cares one way or another if they're in the rock and roll.
And I mean, it's just, it doesn't negate what they do, but it's like, aside from the drugs and the women, everything else about them is not what their persona is.
Yeah.
Just like with Kiss, I don't think they were really big on drugs, but they're womenizing and all
absolutely.
that.
It's legendary.
It's legendary. So once you get past that, is it really, who are they? They're just a bunch of guys who like to make money and like to be famous. So.
Yeah. Going back to the jazz aspect of it, I mean, how is John Coltrane not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Miles Davis, I think Miles Davis was elected in 2000. Yeah, he was elected in 2006. So I mean, Miles Davis is another artist that, like, prior to 2006, I couldn't imagine not being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Right.
But you look at John Coltrane and the influence that his style of jazz had on rock and roll, early rock and roll. No. I mean, you can't argue that the influence is there.
No, not at all. No.
When you've got albums like A Love Supreme, Giant Steps, he's got these iconic jazz albums.
Well, and if you just look at the bands that are in the Hall of Fame, and they were in the Hall of Fame before him, mm-hmm. that were influenced by him. They were obviously influenced by him. That's the other thing. It's like that's another thing that bothers me. It's like you've got all these bands in there that were influenced by other bands who aren't even in the Hall of Fame, and it's the influence is obvious.
Yeah.
It'd be like I said, having Metallica in there makes perfect sense, but having Metallica in there without having Iron Maiden in there makes no sense.
There's definitely some genres of music like jazz, like progressive rock, which I'm guarantee we're going to get to here in a second.
Yeah. Well, and
that are definitely under.
When I was looking at it, it said something. Well, I'll explain it because it does tie with what that. But go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, it's with Jethro Tull, and when I was looking up bands that weren't in the Hall of Fame, I obviously know that Jethro Tull's not in there.
Yeah.
But it said that because they were considered progressive for so long, progressive rock, that may have hurt them. But then you've got bands like Yes in there.
Yeah.
Yes is way more progressive rock than Jethro Tull ever was.
Progressive rock is something that's definitely underrepresented in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
By far.
I think one of the things,
honestly, Yes might be the only band in there that I would even classify as progressive rock.
Pink Floyd.
Oh, Pink Floyd, yeah. Well, I even go back and forth on that because I'd say
everyone other than Ian thinks Pink Floyd was a progressive rock.
I don't know. I see it more as art rock.
It's progressive
It's
rock.
which is an extension of that, but
But
I don't know.
I think one of the things that hurts Jethro Tull is, not in my mind, because obviously I think they're an incredible band. They definitely deserve to be there.
And they've influenced many, many, many.
And
bands.
absolutely they have. I think that the unorthodox
nature of the band,
I think, hurts them in the minds of like the purist rock and roll. But how, if you look at these, the purists that I guess you would say
How would you
run
not get
the
Iron
Rock and
Maiden?
Roll Hall
Right.
of Fame, how would you not have a band like Iron Maiden,
Right.
which
also points to Tull as an influence.
But I think the heavy metal aspect of rock and roll is another area that's kind of underrepresented.
Well, and let's face it, Iron Maiden never really had like #1 hits.
No.
I mean, they had hits, but not mainstream hits. With Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson's answer, whenever someone asks him this, and I don't agree with his answer, but I see his point, is that at least at its inception and what rock and roll is very American, and he sees the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an American institution, and his music is not American music. It started out from an American influence with the blues stuff, but it became very much British, very English sounding, and that's what his music is. It's English rock, it's English progressive rock, whatever. But he says, leave the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for the American artists, because that's what a rock and roll.
But you've got bands like the Who that are in there.
That's why I don't agree with it. There's a lot of British groups in there. Ozzy, we were just talking about Ozzy and Sabbath and all that. Mm-hmm. But to be fair, most of their music has maintained that American, like blues, R&B type rock. Throughout their career, whereas with Tull,
they've experimented and gone different directions.
He made a conscious decision early on to write rock that was slightly more British, more in tune with his sensibilities, and succeeded. So I get it. I do get that, but it would be nice for them to get the recognition I think they deserve.
I just think it's really interesting that a band like Jethro Tull isn't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when you've got. I think arguably the '70s is really seen pretty widely, I guess, accepted as
the greatest,
kind of like the greatest era of rock and roll. Right. And Jethro Tull was a gigantic band during that period. So I think it's kind of hard to say, look, you've got this like golden age of rock and roll, but don't have one of the biggest acts of that decade, in the Hall of Fame. I think it's a big loss.
To be fair, they were still selling out Madison Square Garden in the late 70s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Multiple nights, not just one night, 2-3 nights in a row, selling out Madison Square Garden.
Anyone else you got to toss out there?
No, Kansas.
Yeah, Kansas is one I didn't think of when I was going through.
Because they're I wouldn't say they're a one-hit wonder, but their hits are fewer, but they're huge. And Carry On Wayward Son is, world renowned. Dust in the Wind is world renowned.
They definitely had a couple of really big albums.
Right. Now the only thing I can think of with that is the lineup of Kansas has changed so much over the years that it would be kind of difficult. It's kind of the Ozzy with Sabbath or Ozzy solo kind of thing, because there's a very distinct difference between what Kansas was in the 70s, what Kansas is now, and that blending period that occurred in the 90s and early 2000s. So maybe that's why, but Kansas definitely, I would say, deserves to be in there for sure.
I don't know if I would necessarily put them in there, but I think they definitely deserve to be in the argument. How about that?
Right. Well, I think
they haven't been in the argument.
Kansas deserves to be in there just as much as Journey or Boston.
I don't think Journey deserves to be in there either. But one band that I think does deserve to be in there is Soundgarden.
Oh yeah, and they're past their due. Pearl Jam's in there, but they came in. They were nominated and inducted the first year they were eligible. Yeah. Whereas Soundgarden, I think, is now several years past that point.
And they were obviously one of the big, most influential bands of that mid to late 90s, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. Because if it weren't for Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, that whole era of music, they were at the forefront of it. Yeah. All those bands. Nirvana's in there. Yeah. Soundgarden should be in there. Pearl Jam's in there.
Absolutely. But that's all I had. I had a bunch more on my list, but I didn't want this to drag on too long.
We could talk about this for hours. Honestly.
Absolutely. We had a podcast where we talked about it for, a lot longer than 15 minutes.
We can even break down people who are in there who we probably don't don't think deserve
Oh
to be
yeah,
in there
absolutely.
necessarily. Like Journey,
But
I don't know if I feel that way about Journey, but
drop us some comments down below and tell us some of the artists that you think deserve to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that aren't in there.
yeah,
Right, Ian?
sure.
What else? Give us a thumbs up.
Subscribe.
Hit the subscribe button wherever that bell is on the screen. I have no clue where it's at, but go ahead and hit that so you'll get
It's
notifications.
underneath us somewhere.
Is it? So down here somewhere.
Yeah.
And go down there and click the links and check us out on Facebook and everything else, right?
Indeed.
That's all I got.
What he said. I don't know why I'm here.
That's all I got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.